Journal Club. I hope that you can hear me. Please let us know if you can't, because we're operating off one computer's sound and microphone today. Yes, so this morning we're going to be talking about meta-themes, which, as I read through the article, I thought, I wish I'd had this article, however many years ago when I started doing projects that involve lots of data sets and trying to make sense of them. So I think that this is going to be very helpful just in terms of giving us a framework for thinking about projects where we have lots of data sets and not necessarily cross-cultural, but definitely we have done some cross-cultural research. So nice opportunity to share experiences from projects as well, I think. So as always, this is an informal discussion, so please pop messages in the chat or pop your hand up and jump in and contribute as we go along. So our presenter this morning is Johanni, and I'm going to hand over to you, and thanks for taking this one on.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Can you maybe just let me know if you can hear me? It's always so weird. I don't know if the people online can hear me, if you can maybe just give an indication.
I see some thumbs up,
okay.
So I presume we're okay.
Okay, so morning everyone, I'm Johanni Beerkes. So today I will be talking about metatheme analysis, a qualitative method for cross-cultural research. So this paper discusses how researchers can adapt the thematic analysis method for cross-cultural ethnography by identifying meta-themes or themes that occur across the cultures to analyze patterns in data collected from different countries. So this paper caught my attention as I'm also involved in something similar. I'm doing a thematic analysis for an international study exploring self-perception in educational attainment of high-achieving students from different socioeconomic statuses or contexts. So I'm analyzing the South African component, which comprise the low socioeconomic status context, and then data is also currently being collected in Seattle, Washington. So I'm hoping that we can do something like this to compare the data across the contexts. Please, everyone, don't feel like this is a lecture. Please jump in if you want to say something or share something or discuss.
Is it qualitative research?
It's qualitative research.
Yeah. Just qual. Okay.
So they did a quantitative component and then they realized that this data actually calls for more qualitative work. So now we're trying the qualitative component.
And interview-based?
Yes, it was interview-based. So the data that I'm analyzing now was actually collected by a master's student in 2022. So it's older data that I'm just doing the thematic analysis on now. Okay, so cross-cultural ethnography is a research method that involves studying and comparing different cultures to understand similarities and differences across cultures. It helps the researchers identify common themes, which is called meta-themes, that occur across various cultures. By using this meta-theme analysis, researchers can systematically compare data from different cultural contexts to uncover significant patterns and describe them in culturally specific ways. So that is very important, the culturally specific component. So this type of work explores how meanings are shared across cultural contexts, while also deeply describing and contextualizing meanings in ethnographically situated ways. So cross-cultural ethnography has been an established method since the 1900s, but it was kind of phased out for a while because of developments in other areas of qualitative research. There has, however, been excuse me, a revival of this method in the last 5 years.
Yeah, I was interested as I was reading this article because I was thinking, well, I wonder if there's a danger here of the cultural tourism trap that one falls into, sort of saying this is what South Africans think and do an experience. And this is what Americans think and do an experience. And I wondered if you got that sense as well from the article, or maybe I'm just a little bit touchy about that from other research experiences.
No, I think it's good to think about it, but I think how one can maybe manage that is being open about it in the whatever you're writing, in how you report your results. I think being open about how you perceive this, I think that's how you can maybe mitigate. I don't know. This is also new to me.
No, I don't imagine if we think about some of the other research projects that we're involved with, the need for reflection,
yes,
and reflexivity around one's positionality right from the start, and really interrogating this idea of the collective. Because I guess that's what they're really talking about here, is trying to analyze across context, but with a collective approach in mind. So I guess it's a caveat that maybe one needs to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think the method calls for describing the different sites, the data from the different sites separately as well as the collective. So I think it has two components to it.
Yeah.
Rather than just generalizing.
Yeah.
I guess that's where it comes in. You have to describe the separate samples first and then the collective, I guess.
Yeah. And they said you need double if you're going to do this on a cross-cultural, you double the sample size, because you can't just apply thematic analysis straight. It's got to be much more in depth to take into account the cultural.
Take everything into account.
Yeah.
Okay, so thematic analysis is typically applied to research in single samples or single sites or single languages, with the goal of identifying shared meanings across interviews and other kinds of qualitative data within that single site or that single sample. And although the principles of traditional thematic analysis are used, qualitative metatheme analysis requires additional steps beyond this theme analysis within the single sample. For example, smaller scale themes are often combined into higher level themes by comparing and grouping themes based on their similarities and differences. So I thought that was a nice diagram showing the difference between thematic analysis and metatheme analysis. Briefly, you can see that where thematic analysis is within one sample, metatheme analysis you do across sites. With thematic analysis, you usually use one data analyst. Maybe you can add another one just to kind of check your coding. But with metatheme analysis, it requires multiple data analysts because you need different analysts at the various sites in the various contexts. No translation is needed for thematic analysis, whereas metatheme analysis typically requires translation because it's different contexts. And whereas thematic analysis, the description is deeply embedded in the local context. With metatheme analysis, the description must go beyond the local context. And like we just discussed, maybe it will entail firstly deeply or description within the local context and then move on to descriptions beyond the contexts. So with these additional steps that comes with metatheme analysis, that is where the challenges sneak in. For example, smaller scale themes, like we just said, are often combined into higher level themes by comparing and grouping the themes based on similarities and differences. But these similarities and differences can be easily overlooked or misinterpreted when attempting to compare across different cultures. So this is where the challenges sneak in. So to ensure that cross-cultural comparison of themes can take place, researchers must undertake significant upfront work at every stage of the research project. So that is from data collection throughout data analysis. So firstly, researchers must select non-probability samples in ways that produce comparative data. So from the get-go, you have to think about how you are going to compare the data from different samples. Then secondly, they must also structure semi-structured protocols to yield comparable data while keeping in mind the linguistic, cultural, or social context. So here they have to structure their interviews or whatever data collection they're using in such a way that it's kind of the same how they use it across their different contexts.
So asking the same questions.
Yes, asking the same question so you know you can compare the questions across the data sets.
I was wondering, just going back to the sample point, because they say non-probability, but in essence, you would have to do some kind of sort of purposeful sampling, a purpose of sampling where you're picking specific kinds of people and possibly even doing that on a more formalized or stricter kind of way than you would with a typical thematic analysis project, because I'm thinking of your project now with Seattle, and here you'd want to match the students. But even then there's going to be difference in terms of, for example, undergrads here versus there's something very different there. So you're going to have different ages and potentially different race or gender groups as well in there. So
and I think that's what they're raising here is that you have to, before you start collecting data, you already have to think about these things and think about how they will influence the data that you collect.
Absolutely, So,
but it's hard to anticipate that stuff. I mean, like even you're talking about South Africa and another country, but I'm thinking about like the research that I will be doing with Charmaine, where it's like Barra and Rahima, and it's two separate sites, and there's already multiple languages and there's multiple cultures. And then like
there's already differences.
So it's like, oh, this is I'm supposed to have thought about this already. You know, and I'm not sure how to. Like, I'm not sure how those things. Like, that's why we're doing the research, is we don't know how that will differ between the sites, and we don't know how it will differ between different linguistic groupings or different cultural groupings.
And how predictable is it? So certain kinds of projects, like going into a university and finding students, you've got a big pool to pick from. And so you can be more purposive in the way that you do that. Whereas in a hospital setting, you've just got to take
what you get.
Who's there,
Exactly.
So you don't necessarily have control over those kinds of variables. But I still think that this approach and this idea of this meta-theme analysis could still work and be tweaked to things like a hospital setting where you're connecting from different stakeholders as well. So, you know, you might have input from nurse groups and doctor groups and other health professionals, and in essence, you're doing something similar with combining themes that you picked out across those groups.
Maybe you could address that by including different research questions at the beginning of, like, kind of conceptualizing your research. If you have different research questions with, like you said, different participants, like the doctors and the nurses, and then you can kind of work around the variability that you get in your participants.
Absolutely.
If that makes sense.
I'm thinking of another project that we did where I had to use a lot of meta-theme kind of approaches, where we looked at TB and understandings of TB and experiences of care in the rural community, and we interviewed health professionals, patients, home-based care workers, and then general members of the community. So we had data from 4 different groups within the same community and setting. And we asked them quite similar questions, but obviously some of them were a bit tweaked. So the community members, we wanted to find out about their understanding, but you can't really ask that question to a health professional necessarily. So there were slightly different questions, but in the end, we were able to do something akin to this meta-theme analysis. Just slightly different, but the overarching research questions and the overarching phenomena were the same across the groups. So that's another way of doing it.
So then for the third thing, researchers must make culturally sensitive decisions about report building, positionality, and reflexivity. I think our discussion now comes in there, because with the different participants, you will have to address them differently or interact with them differently. So that's also something that you have to think about upfront.
And this idea of, can you actually compare findings across groups? And is that your goal?
Yeah.
Or is it like the TV project was more about getting a comprehensive picture from stakeholders, whereas the student project with Seattle is more about comparing?
Yeah.
So kind of thinking, what are you really doing with the project?
Yeah.
And what is the goal of the project?
Yeah. Then researchers must also produce meaningful translations that require careful translation and back translation, which makes sense because it will be across different contexts.
Are they talking there just about language, or are they talking about kind of what we would say in the interpreting world, cultural mediation, that you're kind of bringing in an understanding of content and culture?
That comes in as well. So both language and culture would be important here. And then researchers must make complex and intersecting analytic decisions about how to compare the data. So I think you can't be sure of everything beforehand. I think it will develop as you go, but I think what they're trying to say is just keep in mind beforehand that you are comparing across cultures, and there's a few things that might come in the way of you being able to do that. So I think just kind of have an idea beforehand, but I think this also develops as you work through the data.
But again, the reflection
before,
during, and after.
You know, it's always so interesting for me, this idea of having a research question to guide your research, because I can't help thinking of that Hawthorne effect in psychology, where, you know, if you're told that this is a group of good workers, you will find good work behavior. And if you're told this is the problem group, you will find problem behaviors, even though they're randomly assigned. So for me, if you come in with preconceived ideas in the form of a research question, does that not bias your interpretation and your ability to pick up themes? And I think it's a fine line that qualitative analysis researchers have to walk.
Well, it's that difference between inductive and deductive analysis. So are you coming in saying, well, okay, we have obviously some pre-planning and some idea, but we're going to see what the data says, versus I'm going to come in and impose a
having themes already.
Yes,
I want to see if, even saying I want to see if there is confusion, you then have a target to look for, and you will find it. And I do think that is fairly well proved, that if you're looking for behaviors, you will find them.
For sure, So, I mean, there's merit in both approaches, but again, I guess one has to reflect on what you want to get out of the project and where you want to go with it and what's going to be most useful. So, most of the time, I think it's more useful to do an inductive approach, but every so often it's useful to go in and apply a theory or a framework and look for particular things.
So, why is there a need for this qualitative metatheme analysis? So the mixed method literature has produced a quantitative approach to identify metathemes in cross-cultural qualitative data. So here, quantitative approach. These techniques they transform the coded qualitative data into quantitative data matrices of some sort, containing counts of themes. And then these matrices are usually analyzed using quantitative statistical methods, like exploratory factor analysis. However, these types of mixed methods do not produce the rich textual descriptions and comparisons of cross-cultural data that you will get with something like thematic analysis. So hence, there's a need for a more qualitative approach for thicker, richer descriptions. So qualitative metatheme analysis shares goals with other well-established methodological techniques, including thematic analysis and these quantitative or mixed methods, metatheme analysis. But it differs somewhat, like we already discussed. So since qualitative metatheme analysis has not really been procedurally explained, these authors describe their approach using an example of a study with a wild title. It was called Fat in 4 Cultures. which I found very amusing. But in essence, the study consisted of a collaborative cross-cultural ethnographic research project exploring weight-related stigma in 4 cross-cultural research sites, which included Samoa, Paraguay, Japan, and the United States.
It's amazing that people come up with such interesting research topics.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such a relevant one.
And the titles, I mean, they knew they were going to attract people's attention with that title.
Yeah, but also I'm just thinking, talking about culture, weight is perceived differently, in different contexts. In America, for example, it's not like you're fat. Whereas in Japan, it's
Yeah.
So,
And I think that's what makes studies like this very interesting, because then you can get a comparison of how people perceive it.
And the real interest lies in the comparison across contexts.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm not going to go through the entire study design as detailed in the article. I'm rather going to focus on the analytic procedure, the metatheme analysis. But it is important to note that they used exactly the same sampling frame, interview protocol, and analytic process across all 4 cross-cultural data collection sites. So the same method was used at every site.
Which is interesting to me as well, because we always teach students to ground research so strongly in the context, especially qualitative work, and to ask questions and think about what's unique or what's different. And so the orientation of the question asking is often very grounded in the context as well. So it's interesting that they were able to kind of come up with almost a neutral approach to
like
questions,
a blanket approach
that did not necessarily rely on particular contextual understandings of features.
Yeah, I do think that that's an interesting question because, being involved in interviews in various contexts, if you are required for it to be standardized, to stick to the same questions and not probe because it's got to be fair, it actually comes out as a very unfair interview process because people respond differently. And I'm, less inclined to say you have to stick to the protocol and more giving people leeway to actually be almost human, to be able to adapt. The person in front of you is different and adapt to them. But then you don't have the standardized thing. And I think sometimes we get too hung up on the fact that it's got to be the same when people don't respond the same.
Well, I guess that's the difference between the structured and the semi-structured interview. I think I would find it very hard to do a structured interview. I would find it easier to do a qualitative online survey that's highly structured with no probes. Because then there's no opportunity to probe. But as an interview, I think I would find very difficult to just sit and read questions off the list and not
interact.
Roles require different orientations. Cultures require different orientations. But I think standardized is not as laudable as we sometimes think in research.
Well, I think it comes back also to this idea in qualitative research of the subjectivity of the interviewer's lens that is being applied all the way through the research. That the interviewer and the researcher is so integrally part of any qualitative study. So to try and maintain some sort of neutrality is almost impossible.
Yes, but sometimes it's really difficult to identify what the reasons are for like different perceptions. Like you were talking about having a question in mind and that directs what you see. But even amongst like I've seen at with the different members of the team talking about the same patient, and they have different perceptions of the patient's mental state or their emotional, what's going on with them. Sometimes there'll be a patient and everybody agrees that's what's going on with this patient. But sometimes everybody's got a different perspective of the patient, and sometimes wildly differing. And I don't know if it's because of, the person, if I look at Carl versus Butler and what state they're in that day and how the patient is responding to them, or how it is that they are seeing the patient. Like, is it coming from inside their own lens, or is it coming from how the patient is responding to them?
Yeah.
And there's so many variables, and it's difficult to isolate, like, okay, this one is happening because of this, and this one is happening because of this.
You know,
it
patient may
makes it
feel
good.
differently half an hour from now because
Yeah,
they've had a cup of tea.
Yeah.
So all that you're really capturing is a snapshot. And
And I think we forget that. We know it, but we don't take that into account when we analyze.
Sure. It's just so much to think. I always chuckle.
Nothing is true.
And our undergrad students think qualitative research is so much easier. Gosh, no. Yeah.
So to explain this, or their analytic process they proposed, I just got this figure that was in the manuscript to show the different steps or phases in the analytic process. So the first step is to conduct the thematic analysis within each site or within each data set to create lists of themes for each site or data set. So initially you will have a different lists or different sets of themes for each site or data sets. So this is to identify the themes in the data at each site separately. There are many ways to do this thematic analysis, and it would depend on your research question and your design. But here the author suggests that site-specific thematic analysis should be conducted in the language of the data collection to capture the true meaning in the context that it is collected. So when you first collect the data at your specific site, the analysis should be conducted in the same language as the data was collected, and then later it will be translated. I will get back to that later on.
That's interesting. So to analyze
first within that context, in that language. And then later, when you have to get together to compare, then you will translate and compare with the others.
So I guess what they're saying, if you think about that FAT study, so in Japan, the data would be collected in Japanese, analyzed in Japanese.
Yes.
But if we're talking about translations, you wouldn't, like with an interview in isiZulu, you wouldn't do the analysis in isiZulu. Because unless the analyst is able to do that. And that raises a whole nother question of, how does that process work? Because usually we do the translation. So I guess it depends on the particular context.
And I often wonder.
Skill set of the researchers.
I often wonder that if, like you say, if the data is collected in Setswana and then translated and then analyzed, are you not losing a lot of the meaning?
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't be able to figure out what was said here if it was another language. So maybe there is some merit in first analyzing and then translating, and maybe analyzing again or with other people to see, do you find the same themes?
Well, I guess it comes back as well to another question that we could have a whole journal club on itself of how translations are done. So the best way to do them is to actually sit with the person who's doing the translating and have discussions and have a debrief around, what is in here that's difficult to explain or translate, or what does this actually mean? I was chatting yesterday with a PhD student who's had such dramas with translations because she initially had just handed her work over to a translating service. And the translations are all incorrect, and as supervisors we can see that, even though I'm not a language speaker, I can see that there are issues. And now she's trying to disentangle this big mess of translations, and sitting now with someone and doing it how it should have been done, and finding, there's all sorts of terminology and ways of speaking that are really not translatable, and that need to be captured somehow in the translation, in brackets or footnotes or whatever it is. So that's a whole process in itself.
And if you don't know the language, do you know the culture? So should you be analyzing anyway? Because
and culture is so
that insider outsider issue.
Exactly, and as we know, culture is also so micro in terms of its applicability. So I always think about there was a study a student did with a she was trying to develop a test for people's language impairment up in rural Mpumalanga, and she found in terms of practices and naming of vegetables, for example, was different in one village to the one next door. So it's that sensitive in terms of context. So again, coming back to what I said earlier about that danger of cultural tourism, this is what South Africans think. This is what Americans think.
No, you can't really do that.
Yes. Well, there's a whole nother discussion around cultural competence training that happens in medical schools, which is often along these lines. This is what Spanish people think. This is what Hispanic people think. This is what it's terrible.
It's also so complicated because like many people speak multiple languages. Like even in in Peru, for example, someone might speak Spanish, but they also speak Quechua. And in South Africa also we have people speaking like English and Zulu and Tswana. And then the language of the person doing the interview is going to maybe speak a particular language and that person speaks that language. But then now they're having the conversation in Tswana instead of Zulu, and how does that affect it as well?
And everything's so enmeshed and tangled, and that's just how life is at the moment.
So the second step is to collaboratively identify the cross-cultural metathemes. So this is where all researchers from each site or each data set come together to systematically compare, discuss, and debate the list of themes and extract a smaller set of meta-themes or overarching themes. How you would do this would also depend on your research design and questions. So in the figure, they gave some options: constant comparison, pile sorting, thematic network analysis. But these researchers used pile sorting, which I found very entertaining. So the themes were printed on decks of cards, the themes from every data or every site. And then these cards were sorted into piles, which would then later form the meta themes. I find that quite a fun way of analyzing data.
And very visual as well. Often I think it's a challenge as a qualitative researcher to figure out how you're going to do the analysis, the logistics of it. And if you think of the options available, you can use software, which then loses, and that's one of the issues I have with QDAS and qualitative data analysis software, is that you lose that bigger picture and being able to lay things out on the table and see what's actually happening. So that's quite a nice option for using for analysis, or sticky notes or something, I guess.
Oh, make it fun. Why not make it fun while you're at it?
But it's also the interactive element. So it's not one analyst doing this by themselves. It's a
group of researchers.
And that again is then back to the type of triangulation. You've got multiple researchers involved and multiple perspectives. And that's a whole other can of worms. What Brenda and I have been working on with, what happens when you've got so many different positionalities within a research project, and you're bringing all of those to the analysis. And how do you disentangle those and reflect on those? So this is
not easy.
I looked up some of these methods. So the constant comparison is a grounded theory approach. And then the thematic network analysis seemed to be creating webs and how the themes actually connect with each other.
How they relate to each other.
So I guess
a mind map
kind of thing.
So I guess one can also pick and choose, and not necessarily stick to one approach, but find what works for that particular project. Play around, I guess.
So in terms of handling the language and cultural differences, we touched on this earlier. The authors highlighted the importance of doing some sort of cross-site comparison in a shared language. So this means that after the data is analyzed in its original language, it should then be translated to the shared language, like English, and then analyzed again. They refer to this as, what did I just say? The cross-site comparison.
Yeah, this was interesting. So you're doing almost a double process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a bit more tedious, but to me, I think you would get
rigorous.
More. Yeah, it's more rigorous. So they also highlighted the importance of fluency in the language of data collection and cultural knowledge of the context where the data is collected to ensure that the data is not translated or misinterpreted or missed completely. So language and cultural knowledge is very important with metatheme analysis. So as with all analytic methods, metatheme analysis has benefits and challenges. So let's start with the benefits found by the authors. So firstly, credibility. Discussing, comparing and negotiating metathemes with other researchers or field workers who collect the data from the other sites or other cultural contexts allow a space for probing assumptions, which enhances the credibility of the data analysis. So obviously, credibility is a measure of the truth or value of qualitative research. So being able to compare with others increases your credibility. And then direct comparison. Metatheme analysis allows for a deeper engagement with the data, both individually at the individual research sites or at the separate sites, and also across the different sites. So the comparative steps or comparative step where the one thematic analysis at a specific site is compared to that of another allows for cross-cutting metathemes to be developed through systematic comparison. Then the third one is synthesis. Metatheme analysis allows for fusion of the research findings from the broader study. So it allows analysts to not only identify cross-cutting themes, but also show how these themes manifest in different cultures or contexts. So to me, that means you have to describe both site-specific findings as well as findings across the contexts.
I like all these new words that have popped up. We always just talk about triangulation, but here they've got words like fusion and synthesis, which are actually more akin to what one's trying to do.
Yeah.
Triangulation is almost more a comparison. I mean, I guess there is comparison here, but what they're saying as well is they're looking for a bigger picture.
Yeah.
So they're comparing, but they're also wanting to synthesize and
use. Yeah.
What I also like is just that notion that people have complex lives and this is a complicated world.
Yeah.
That for me just summarizes why you do qualitative analysis.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And why it's so challenging actually as well, because you've got to make sense of so many nuances.
Yeah. And then the last benefit is scalability. So metatheme analysis ensures the conventional advantages of highly nuanced and small-scale thematic analysis, while also giving researchers the ability to scale up the study across many settings. So this approach thus facilitates the application of global and transnational research to real-world problems.
It's really very systematic.
Yeah.
I quite like their approach here. They really are considering all sorts of things from
language
to context.
I think it's a nice place to start. I think it will involve a lot of consideration and a lot of playing around with the steps and the process. But I think as a place to start from, I think this is a very nice approach.
Johanny, is it ever possible to do it as a single author, or do you have to work within a group?
I think this type of analysis would always be as a group.
Yes, you could, but you'd have to build in mechanisms for what we'd say peer debrief, or member checking, something where you're getting some kind of so either you're going back to the participants to get input on whether they agree with your themes, or you're getting peers to have a look and see have you done your analysis. Are you on track with it? So and I think can't do it without.
And I think it would also depend on where your research context would be and how familiar that one researcher would be at the different contexts.
It's cross-culturally would be unusual.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Yeah, I mean that would be a disaster. Just me myself, my place to know and understand.
All people.
Yeah. So then lastly, let's look at some of the challenges of meta-theme analysis. Firstly, I think we discussed all of this throughout, but the first one is obviously constraints of protocols. So like they mentioned, that some standardization of data collection is necessary for meta-theme analysis, for example, adopting semi-structured interviews across the research sites. So the challenge here is that some of the themes might be missed that would have emerged if you used more exploratory interviewing styles. Then secondly, prior experience. So cross-cultural meta-theme analysis requires a deep knowledge and experience within each research context. So without this contextual knowledge and experience, some analysis, again, may be misunderstood or fail to identify the themes that are actually important. Then data depth. Meta-theme analysis requires enough data to substantiate the themes within the site before comparing to other sites. So this means that there's a lot of data necessary to do this. And they mentioned that observational field notes may also be required to act as a check for the meta-themes identified.
Can I ask you, Honey, how many participants are you looking for in your study, the education one?
So I had the thematic analysis that I did was only on 12, which I found was a very small sample.
Yeah, but they suggest sample size, if I can't remember.
They didn't in this paper,
No.
they didn't.
Yeah.
But I would assume that you need a lot of data to be able to compare cross-culturally.
I think the quantitative one is 15.
Yeah.
I cannot read.
I mean, they usually
Also
say data
fairly-
saturation, and usually they say it's 12 to 15.
Oh, really?
But I mean, that would also depend on how long your interviews are, how many questions are you asking, what type of questions are you asking. So yeah.
It's all relative, so one can't really put a number on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, how much is enough data, I guess. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
you'll never know.
yes, and hopefully when we reschedule that journal club on the data saturation issue, I think that will answer some of those questions.
Yeah. So the last challenge for meta-theme analysis is team dynamics. So a team-based approach to meta-theme analysis requires trust and respect, and analysts must be able to iteratively question and challenge each other in a productive way, which I think would be a big challenge. So here, good teamwork is essential.
And again, reflection amongst the team.
Yeah.
Because that's where we've come unstuck in previous projects, where we've made assumptions and we haven't actually interrogated the positionality, particularly of everybody and what we bring into this and how we, and then we end up saying, well, what are we actually doing in this project?
Yeah.
We collected the data and we're still not sure.
Yeah.
I think I'd also add a fifth challenge here, and the major challenge this study really highlights is that this kind of work is slow research.
Yeah.
No, this takes time.
Yeah.
This is not a quick wham bam and you've got a product. It's really, really slow if you're going to do it properly. Which again, that's a whole other discussion that editors and HODs and NRFs and all of those people don't necessarily understand that this kind of work is often years worth.
Yeah.
It's not quick.
Okay, that's my presentation. Short and sweet.
So I think there's a lot that we can learn from this, and I'm always thinking about projects I've been involved in, and what might be useful to learn and how one could apply this kind of method to other projects. So I was thinking also of a project where I've done it at one site, but with data from, again, different stakeholders, but there was ethnographic observational data and then interview and focus group data. So also trying to make sense of and get meta themes out of that. And again, I like this concept of synthesis and fusion, because that's really what you're trying to do in that kind of a project, is pull together a lot of data and kind of make sense of it, and come up, I guess, with meta themes. So I like this principle, and I think it could be applied in quite a lot of different kinds of projects. So not just this kind of a cross-cultural project. Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking also, I know Kim's on this call, and she and I are co-supervising a student who's used something called a pillar integration process, with trying to make sense of, she's got a lot of different data, different types of data in an educational study. And some of it is quant and some is qual, and trying to figure out themes from those. And what that approach has given her is an ability to try and sift out themes from the quant and from the qual and try and compare the two. But then she's got multiple quant, multiple qual data. And so she's in the process of trying to write up a paper on trying to make sense of that kind of a data set where there's just so much going on. And pulling that together into some coherent whole. So it's always interesting to find out about these kinds of approaches, often after you've done a project like this, side by side. But I guess it's, that's the nature of what we do, is we're constantly learning and thinking. How can we improve things in the way that we do research? So I guess we need to go and read up on the results of that FAT study.
Yeah, I'll go and look for it.
To see what they actually came up with. But I would imagine, Sonja, it's probably along similar lines of what you'd said, that there are very distinct cultural orientations towards weight gain, weight loss, and very culturally mediated. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else in the room or online has examples from projects that you've been involved in where maybe a meta-thematic approach might be useful, or you can talk about some of your experiences, because that would be useful just to hear from everybody. Shot at once.
Can I comment?
Yes, go.
Yes. No, I just want to say it's the first time that I'm thinking about multi-site studies across countries. I've never had the privilege of working across multiple countries. So it really did bring to light the challenges around that. But the two issues that stood out for me, I think we've covered in the last two challenges. I went and tracked, I'm always looking for articles that can justify sample size. Students always ask how many. And so when they made reference to that guest article, I went and found that, because they used that as a justification for why they felt that 16 was sufficient in each of their sites, if I understand correctly. Is that correct, Johanni, that they had a minimum of 16 per site? And then then the guest article from 2006 actually says that 12 is sufficient for data saturation, and I think, if I recall correctly, or six is sufficient, where you start to see meta-themes, but they weren't talking about meta-themes in the sense of multi-site studies, the guest article. Anyway, it was interesting to think about sample size and look at and to access the references that this article had used to justify their sample size. And then the other issue that I was compelled by pertains to the team dynamics, and I didn't see any reference. I don't know if they could write about it, but around power, I think indirectly it's probably in the team dynamics. And my assumption is that the US site and researchers, I'm just assuming, had more power. And even the fact that the article's written in English denotes that all of the power might be located in the US site. So yeah, that's my experience of working with multiple team members, is around dynamics of power and how those must become even more significant in multiple country sites, especially where there's differing socioeconomic status. Yeah.
That's such an interesting point, Nick, because then I guess it begs the question of who's the best leader in this kind of a project. Who should be leading it. And I guess, again, it requires a lot of reflexivity and engaging with these issues, which is not always possible in these kinds of projects. If you've been approached by, for example, a US collaborator, and they're looking for international people to work on a project, they're the ones who designed it, who come up with the idea, and they may or may not be open to tweaking the design, or might be too late down the line of the process to actually give input or to change things. I'm thinking of a study that a number of us were involved in psychology during COVID, where it was a US psychologist who designed a study, and he had people collecting data across many, many countries. I think there were 50 countries involved around social and moral psychology during COVID. And by the time it came to us, the project was designed, and it was literally, this is what you must go and do. This is the data tool if you go and collect the data. So there wasn't an opportunity to give input or to contribute to the design, although there was opportunity to contribute to publications later on. But it was, yeah, it was quite a strange experience in a way, because we kind of came in halfway through, collected the data, and then because it was such a large team as well, there wasn't really opportunity to meet or to discuss other than to give input into the publication. So
Because quantity.
interesting. Yeah, look, it was a quant study, that one. But nonetheless, it, you know, it makes you think about how these kinds of projects are designed, and at what point does one get input from team members? Yeah.
What have you left out? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, it was a kind of a strange experience. It was lovely to be involved, and a real privilege to be able to be connected with such a large group, but the connection aspect wasn't always there. Certainly in terms of what I would have expected or thought might be valuable. But then again, if you've got hundreds of researchers working on a project, how do you coordinate that kind of level of engagement, even across, say, 3 or 4 sites?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's so interesting about this sort of how much of a sample size. I often think sometimes going outside the research field gives you almost real world validation, because they asked teachers once, what is your favorite class size? And they said a minimum of 8. 8 is, well, not a minimum, but not less than 8. Because if it's 8, you've got enough of a cross-pollination of ideas and the opportunity for a child to step back and just like sit. If they, you know, they don't constantly have to be in your radar. Because sometimes they just need time to process, they're not in the mood. And then the other favorite size was 24. So because again, it was manageable, and they said anything more than 8, though, you don't get any individual one-on-one interaction. So 8 is a nice number because you can have individual and you get the cross-pollination of ideas. Otherwise 24, but then your expectations are that there's not one-on-one work. So I just thought that was quite an interesting way of looking at from a practical way of what works in the real world.
Yeah, I guess that would be an interesting question to see if there's literature on what is the ideal team size for a.
Yeah.
I guess you know, there's no such thing as a concrete answer, same as what is the ideal number of interviewees for saturation, you know, if that concept really exists. But yeah, very interesting to consider, to hear from people's experiences of working in teams. You know, what works, what doesn't. Yeah, not easy. Yeah, Nick, I was also thinking about your point about advising students on sample sizes, because that's like an age-old issue. And we're hoping to, at some point in the next few months, we've got a session planned on to saturate or not to saturate, which addresses some of these issues of sample size and what do we do in terms of advising students. I do find Vaughan and Clark's book quite helpful. They give ballpark figures on a small project, a medium project, and a large project, which I kind of equate to honours level, master's level, and PhD level. That at least that's a starting point of how many to aim for. But I guess again, it's all kind of relative. And these days, it also seems to be very mediated by how many people you can actually get and recruit into your study, because that is a huge challenge. So sometimes you just got to take what you can get. Yeah, so no easy answers there. Yeah, are there some more questions from the room or from the virtual room? It's been a very interesting discussion. I hope it sparked some thoughts about projects and where to from here. I was also thinking about another project I've worked on that was a cross-country one, But that was a bit different. It was transcribed healthcare interactions from Italy, and then doing a comparison with transcribed interactions from South Africa. I'm looking specifically at, remember that paper, terminology and how that is dealt with. So that was a bit different in that we didn't have a lot of contact with the Italian researchers, other than they kind of gave us a data set and said, see what you can do with this. What do you see in here? We're interested to know. So there wasn't a lot of discussion around cultural texture features there. And maybe there should have been in hindsight, at least. And self-wise certain projects, constantly learning. Yeah. Any final thoughts on meta themes? Definitely something to think about going forward. I'm going to post in the chat the link to that pillar integration process that student with Kim and I have used, because that has been quite useful. Just to think about different ways of dealing with large data sets and trying to make sense of them. Yeah, not an easy journey, and I guess work in progress, and there's no recipe for how to do this. So tweak it, adapt it, think about it, and I guess the main principle is just to do careful planning and careful discussions with your team members around what's going to work, what you need to think about. And continue that process all the way through the research and afterwards as well. Yeah, see some typing in the chat. I hope that you found it interesting. Zaytoon and Nick, it was good to have you, and Kim. Yeah, and hopefully the next meeting, we'll probably skip July, but meet again in August. And yeah, see if we can return to data saturation at some point. That was our last meeting, which is cancelled, unfortunately. So thanks so much for joining. And yeah, we hope to see you again in a couple of months' time. Sonto, I think you will download the register. Yes. Okay, and then Sonto might be in touch in terms of CPD points, yes, all important CPD points. And Nick, yes, we'd love to have you present if you're happy to do so. It's always great to have alternative views and input from others in the school. So yes, if anybody else would like to take on a presentation of our journal club, we're very open to that. So thanks so much for joining, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.